I haven't seen the third Pirates of the Caribbean movie since it came out in theaters, but I was recently sent an email with a screenshot of a moment that I had forgotten about. And that was this one right here. If you'll notice, Davy Jones is spinning, so you know what that means. How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylai Hobby Time. I hope you enjoyed that dollar store Pirates of the Caribbean theme music for the intro. To make the assembly easier later, I'll be constructing Davy Jones around this tube, which fits perfectly in this shaft coupler, and all I have to do is tighten some set screws and we'll be good to go. As is the case with most characters who find themselves spinning unnecessarily, it's hard to find action figures or ready-made STLs for those moments, and I'm not sure why. But because of that, I will be sculpting this character from clay. I began with an armature wire followed by some foil, after which I put on the rice and calamari for this sushi roll that makes up the layers of Davy Jones' skin and clothing, as well as his left hand, which is a claw. It's either a crab claw or a lobster claw, I'm not sure. I'm sure one of you guys will be able to tell me in the comments. Either way, it was my first time sculpting a crab or lobster claw, and I'm happy with the way it turned out. Before moving on to the rest of the figure, I took a break from sculpting to get the sword sorted. I started with a sheet of 040 styrene, and I sliced a nice thin sliver with a subtle taper that I could turn into the blade of the rapier. I used an emery board and a file to shape the blade, get it looking a little bit sharp, and then once it was the right shape, I snipped it to length and I used the same method to make the guard. After that, I shaped a tang at the base of the blade, which I put into a grip made from styrene tubing. And then after that, to make the pommel, I used a drill and I lathed it to the correct shape. When that was done, I snipped it off, and for the knuckle guard, I used a flattened rod of styrene, which I curled over and glued in place. With that, the pirate sword was ready. I could work on the rest of the body, including the right hand and the barnacle-covered suit, which started its life looking like a Jedi robe, but I was able to quickly turn into a suit jacket. I sculpted the right hand, which is passable. It holds the sword, which is the intention, but now that I'm looking at it, it probably should have had more tentacles coming off of it, because that is how it's seen in the movie. But his face will have plenty. To prevent myself from losing progress as I made it, I used a heat gun to partially cure everything as it was finished. The next step was to sculpt the face, if you can even call it that. The next step was to sculpt the octopus. I began throwing on all the layers of tentacles and sculpting the facial features, hitting it with a heat gun when I was happy with how it looked. As I'm watching this, I realized I missed a lot of details. Like when I flipped him around, I forgot to make the octopus bag. I don't think that's the technical term for it, but you know what I'm talking about. But anyway, it got covered up by his oversized hat, which was the next step in the process. I refined the shape of the hat till it looked somewhat like what I saw in my reference photo, and with that, Mr. David Jones was done and ready to be fully baked. Just not with his plastic sword. If you'll remember from the scene, Davy Jones is chasing Jack Sparrow around the deck of the ship, and Jack does one of those playground tricks by putting himself on the other side of the Kraken dinner bell. Same kind of move you're supposed to do if you're being attacked by a bull moose and there are trees around. Anyway, to make the Kraken dinner bell, I used an old matcha whisk box and some popsicle sticks. I sanded the plastic so the glue would stick better, and if you'll remember from the movie, the wooden pattern on the dinner bell does not quite look like this. But at this point, I'm freewheeling, and there will just be things that are different than the screen accurate, which is okay. The next step was to slice some pushing handles. Also don't know if that's the technical name for them, but after those had been cut, I shaved them all down to a more handlesome look. Once shaved, I glued them all in place. So like I mentioned at the beginning, I haven't seen this movie since it came out in 2007. So I forgot that Davy Jones is kind of like a ghost and he can move through things, and that's how he's able to go through this dinner bell. I thought, based off my reference photo, that he had come in half and his octopus lower half was crawling across, but that's not the case. He's actually just moving straight through it. So that's just one more addition to the list of my interpretations for this project. Also, can you guys believe how long it's been since these movies were released? It just feels like yesterday. Where's the time gone? After some rivets, the last thing to do was to add some rusty texture using some thinned down Tamiya putty. And with that, Davy Jones' Kraken dinner bell merry-go-round construction was done, and it was time to paint. And while I paint this guy, I would like to, of course, give a huge shout out to all of the patrons who keep this channel running. After a quick zenithal highlight, starting with gray and followed by white, I went to paint this guy. And I wanted to paint him with a wet blended look, because him being a sea creature and all, I thought that would be fitting. So I used contrast paints and I blended them directly on the model. After Davy had all his base coats, I used the same method to paint the wood, and then I painted on a few individual details like the sword. To tie everything together, I gave the whole thing a coat of burnt umber and green oil washes, and then once those had dried, it was time to layer on the highlights. After this first round of painting, I wasn't completely happy with the contrast, so off camera I did go back and darkened some of the shadows, also brought the highlights to an even lighter degree, and I'm really happy with it, but I did do that off camera, so that part isn't documented. After the light green highlights on the wood, the last thing to do was to punch up the contrast using an enamel pin wash and set that aside to work on the base. I started with a motor mount that has the same hole pattern as the motor I'll be using. After I had found the center, I began drilling the holes. The big one in the middle is larger than any of the bits that I have, so I used my Dremel to progressively widen that until it would fit the shaft coupler. I then marked out the screw holes using the motor mount as a template. I raised the height of my drill press, and I drilled said holes. I drilled one more additional hole for the switch, and I forgot to drill a hole for the power cord until later. With most of the holes drilled, the next step was to create the surface that the wheel will sit on, which is the deck of the ship. I cut up some balsa wood, which is easy to make look like wood. All you have to do is remind it of its origins. And I glued that to the top of the box, and I impressed my panel lines. Next, I went to town with the wire brush to give it more grain, and finally, I made breaks where the boards would meet end to end. And honestly, it still looked a little bit plain at this point, so I decided to bring back the clay and sculpt a few more larger decorative barnacles. I took those aside to bake, and then I stippled on more of the Tamiya putty paste before gluing the hardened barnacles back on to the deck. And they may be a little bit large for the scale of the diorama, but they help frame Davy Jones when he's in place, which is their purpose. After priming the deck, I painted it the same way that I painted the dinner bell. Just like the wood on the dinner bell, I highlighted all of the wooden planks with a ghostly light green. This is the deck of the Flying Dutchman after all, and may not be screen accurate, but at least it's lore accurate. To SpongeBob. One final thing for the display portion of this piece was a unifying coat of sea green glaze applied using the airbrush to the deck and to the wheel. After that, the last bit of paint to apply was to the sides, and that was Black 4.0. With all of the painting steps done, it was finally time to assemble the moving parts. I installed my potentiometer first, and as I was doing that, I received the motor in the mail. Thankfully, everything did indeed fit. The one thing I had miscalculated though was the height of the collar on the motor, so I made a little spacer from acrylic off camera, and that did the trick. I threaded all the little bolts through the holes, and then I tightened them up nice and snug before throwing the power cord port into the hole that I had drilled off camera. All the components were easily wired together using a screwdriver except the motor itself, which did require a little bit of soldering. To reach that last little set screw that holds Davy Jones in place, I drilled a small hole in the base of the dinner bell, which worked like a charm. After locking up Davy Jones nice and tight and making sure that he was not going to fly off of this thing at full speed, I called it good.
Do you feel dead? Do you feel like the dark abyss?
That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.